It's a whiskey book that is unlike any of the other whiskey books out there on the shelves. It does feature tasting notes, and it does feature some distillery histories, but both distillery histories and tasting notes are only a small section towards the end of the book. And these tasting notes in this book are quite unique because I don't feature a great many whiskies, but there was several rules that I wanted to use for the whiskies to be included in the tasting notes, and that was that the whiskies had to be readily available in the shops everywhere, and also has to be affordable. Because, as I say, there's a line in the tasting notes, in the introduction to the tasting notes, where I use a line that goes something like, it's something like, I see no use in extolling the merits of an ultra-rare and ultra-expensive single malt when most of us won't get to taste it. Now, I've written several other books for my publisher, Pen and Sword. Here are a couple here. This is Dark Valleys, Foul Deeds among the South Wales Valleys, 1945 to 2016. So this is an exploration of historical crimes. All these books are still available, but as you can see, you know, the publisher always does a great job in putting them together. This is the paperback version, and it's a montage here of stories basically covered in the book. You've got Harry and Meghan Touzier, who were a couple who were murdered back in, I can't remember offhand, it was the 90s, I think, and the murder still hasn't been solved. There's John Cooper there, known as the Bullseye Killer. His story was recently televised. These were the coastal murders up in West Wales, Swansea, all that area. So anyway, that's Dark Valleys. There's also A Date with the Hangman, which is an exploration of capital punishment throughout the ages. You've got Cardiff and the Valleys and the Great War, and Cardiff and the Valleys at War, 1945 to 1939 to 1945. Now, the new book, A Dark History of Whiskey, as I say, it's unlike any other whiskey book because it's got everything that most whiskey books have. But it's also, the emphasis of this book is on the darker history of whiskey. So we learn all about the whiskey insurrection in America, the way that Scottish and Irish whiskey smugglers back in the day used to the methods they used to employ to keep their illicit whiskey away from the beady eye of the taxman. It's got a lot of that. There's a massive section on prohibition in America, and a look at how the prohibition on alcohol sales allowed for the rise of organised crime, because there was already organised crime in America before Prohibition, but Prohibition just shifted it up a gear, you know, when you found gangs, previously rival gangs, cooperating with each other because the revenue created by Prohibition was absolutely massive, and it was in everyone's best interest to keep their activities peaceful, not to draw too much attention from the authorities. There's so much more in there. We've got a lot of legends of distilleries, haunted distilleries, so there's stories of ghosts and ghouls and goblins. There's a feature on Towser, the world famous cat, who's actually featured in the Guinness Book of Records for having the most mouse kills. Towser, of course, was a distillery cat. It's a very famous story. Anyway, all that's in the book. Sawney Bean's cannibal family, their story is featured in the book. Whether they existed or whether it's just folklore is unclear, but it's become well known enough that it warrants featuring in the book. And as the character said in the wonderful John Ford Western, Who Shot Liberty Valance, when the truth becomes legend, print the legend. Something like that. Anyway, that's The Dark History of Whiskey, and I will be doing... Let me just read you a section from the book. Here, let me just open it up on screen. Okay, now in the section on Scotch blends and the tasting notes, I've written, blended Scotch makes up the biggest selling whiskey category in the world and counts for more than 90% of global whiskey sales, with the remainder being made up of everything else. So do the math. There are more than 100 malt distilleries in Scotland alone, and none of these could function based on the limited, though growing share of the whiskey market held by single malts. Those distilleries, those single malt distilleries, owe their very existence to the blended whiskey industry. It is thanks to the blenders that malt distillers are able to make a profit by supplying their whisky to the blending houses, who then blend the malts and single grain whiskies to come up with a consistent product time after time. The art of blending, and it is an art rather than a science, comes only from a deep understanding of the nuances of each single malt and grain whisky and the qualities that each can bring to a blend. So that leads me to talking about this inexpensive whisky today. It is Bell's. You can get this practically everywhere. It's always been there. This is probably the whiskey that your grandfather drank. So it's a blended whiskey. That means it's made up of 1 or 2 single malts and at least 1 or maybe 2 grain whiskies in this mixture. So it contains grains and single malts. I don't know exactly what's in Bell's, but it's believed to be upwards of 40 different whiskies. It's matured in oak casks. It comes in at 40%, and of course it's a product of Scotland. It would be, being Scotch whisky. Now this is inexpensive. This is a litre bottle here. Generally goes in the shop for around 20 to 22 pound. So that's not expensive. It's a blended Scotch, and that is an issue that I have with the way that whiskey, the whiskey interest has gone in recent years, because you've got scores of YouTube channels that review whiskies, and the majority of them, not all of them, but the greatest majority of them seem to be under the impression that single malts are totally, right across the board, superior to blended whiskies. That's bullshit. That's just not so. There are some real quality single malts, you know, and that you wouldn't want to use mixed or in a blend. There are some brilliant single malts, but there are also some poor single malts. And what you've got to remember is that it is the art, the duty of the blending houses, especially the master blender, to make sure that you produce a good quality whiskey consistently time after time. So there are several single malts in this whiskey. There's grain whiskey in this whiskey, but there are several single malts. And what they do is, by combining malts and grains, they produce a flavour that is familiar to the the drinker of their brand. So for instance, I drink this bottle of Bell's today, and then I jump forward, say 3 years, and buy another bottle of Bell's, then that flavour, that experience should be consistent across both bottles. It generally is. Sometimes, of course, they can't get exactly the same whiskies that they've always used, and the recipe has to be tweaked. The mixture, the blend has to be tweaked. But it always comes out with that quality taste. And what you get from Bell's, now I'm drinking this over ice, because that's the way I prefer to take my whiskey, over ice. And again, you'll have purists now really sniffing their noses at that and go, ooh. Because yeah, once it's true that by the addition of ice to whiskey does lower the temperature and subdues some of the flavours, it doesn't subdue all of the flavours, and it makes it, to my palate, a much more pleasant drink. Now, to the nose with Bell's, I get a traditional whiskey aroma. Ethanol, of course. Not much smoke. Perhaps some fruit. And to the palate, I get a biscuity, like a digestive-y, biscuity taste. It's quite delicious. Some dark fruits. The finish lingers on the palate, and that is my point. Don't, especially if you're just starting your whiskey journey, don't allow yourself to be overly influenced by the pretentiousness of the people who are blinded to the fact that blends can sometimes be equal to single malts. All a single malt is basically a blended whiskey. It's not pure. It is a blended whiskey. The way they define a single malt is that it's made only from malts. So it's blended only from malts from a single distillery. Unless, of course, it's called single cask. If it's single cask, then yes, it's just come out of the one cask, and that is a one malt in that whiskey. But the majority of single malts are not sold as single cask. They're sold as single malts, which mean they are a blend of different whiskey casks, admittedly from the same distillery, and then blended together. So whilst you are getting one type of of malt with a single malt. It's not necessarily only one type of malt, you know. They can use different variations to create that single malt. So in a sense, and a very real sense, a single malt remains a blended whiskey, unless of course you've got a blended malt whiskey. Now a blended malt whiskey again contains malt whiskey, in other words there's no grain whiskey, but these malts can come from several distilleries. So there are various variations on the theme. We're from blended whiskey to single malt whiskey to blended malt whiskey to even blended grain whiskey or single grain whiskey these days. I've tasted a single grain whiskey only once. Recently tasted a single grain whiskey and I was really surprised. It was a beautiful, creamy taste to it. So there are variations on whiskey that you see in the supermarkets time after time are not necessarily inferior to the single malts, which are usually on the higher shelves above them, and twice, sometimes 3-4 times the price. They're not necessarily inferior. There are some damn decent blended whiskies out there. Even Johnny Walker Red, which is the lowest in the Johnny Walker range, is a bloody good blend. And in some areas, some countries around the world, it's highly sought after. So it's not looked upon with the snobbery that we seem to have in the old market. And that snobbery's got to go because we're missing out. For instance, this Bell's, there's nothing wrong with this Bell's. It's a decent draft.
I'd like to introduce you to...
They're very biscuity, very oaty. Some dark fruits. It's quite delicious. So anyway, that's just a little rant on my soapbox there about the quality of blended Scotch whisky.